Today, I'm speaking to Kevin T. Carter, emerging markets expert and founder of EMQQ Global. Welcome to the show, Kevin. How are things?
Things are good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries at all. So when you first appeared on the Opto Sessions podcast, your episode was entitled "The Biggest Growth Opportunity in the History of Capitalism." So that was a quote taken from a McKinsey report that you've referenced on the EMQQ Global website. But to what extent does that quote relate to the opportunity in India's internet and e-commerce sectors, do you think?
Well, in many ways, India is going to be one of the most important parts of that growth story. And the quote you're mentioning actually is, as you said, from McKinsey and Company, and it speaks to the growth of consumption in emerging markets. And basically, there's 85% of the world's people are in emerging and frontier markets. So, the numbers are huge. They're younger, their demographics are better, so they're even more of the future. About 90% of the world's people under the age of 30 are in emerging markets. And while we've had consumption in the United States and the developed world for several generations now, right? We've got food, clothing, appliances, we take vacations, we have cars, we have children that can go to college. Most of the world doesn't have those things, but they're getting those things today. Their incomes are rising. And so this is this growth story that McKinsey references. And in terms of India itself, India has the largest number of those young people. And what is making the story even more exciting is that not only is this, as McKinsey said, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, growth opportunities ever, those billions of new consumers are also getting two other things that we have taken for granted. They're getting their first computer, and it's not a desktop. It's a $100 Android-based smartphone that's getting better and more affordable every year. So they're getting online for the first time. They've never had, desktop computers with internet access. And so as these billions of people get that smartphone and go online for the first time, and because they don't have bank accounts, they don't have Target stores, they're leapfrogging traditional consumption, and their consumption will be even more digital than ours. And this story has played out in the United States. It's playing out and has largely played out in China, which has been the biggest part of the story. And now India, with a population that's past China's this year, is getting online. And what we saw in China for the last decade plus, I think we'll see the same kind of growth in India for the next decade and a half.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get back to the favorable demographics in that region and just India in general. And that will be the focus of today's interview. But before we do, perhaps to set the context, I read EMQQ Global's research report published at the end of last year, which was titled Changing Tide. So the report suggested we could be at an inflection point after an extended period of poor sentiment for emerging markets in general. So today, in April 2023, to what extent was it an inflection point, and kind of where are we in that narrative now, do you think?
Well, the fundamental story of this growth that's happening in the internet and e-commerce part of emerging markets, that's been pretty much intact and one directional, and even was accelerated by the pandemic. In terms of the markets and the stocks and the recovery of the emerging market indexes broadly, and also the internet companies that we invest in, we had a very dark October, and there's really there was a 2-year stretch where our stocks declined basically 30% each of the last calendar years, and there was all sorts of worries and concerns out in the world, and those fears sort of peaked, it seemed, in late October when the Chinese Congress ended and Xi Jinping had gained his third term, and people thought, oh no, this is it for China. And I think what happened after that was that China surprised the world, and they came out in a much more friendly, pro-business support of the e-commerce and platform companies like Alibaba. Valuations had gotten so low that you saw several of the major Wall Street firms upgrade their outlook for emerging markets. So I'd like to think we're at an inflection point, and that the tough couple of years we had are behind us, but I don't make short-term stock market predictions. And all I know is that, what gives companies value is profits, and the way they can grow their value is by growing their profits. And I don't know of any sector on the planet that's growing their revenue as fast as the emerging market internet companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's get back to that long-term, more fundamental story then. I read that 27% of the world's Gen Z population live in India, which was quite an astounding fact. I think I found that on your website as well. So, yeah, just talk to us and flesh out kind of the demographics in this part of the world. Why are they so favorable to the long-term growth opportunity, particularly in the tech sector?
Sure. Well, in India and South Asia, you have three of the 10 largest countries on the planet. You have India with 1.4 billion people soon.
Mm-hmm.
To the west, you have Pakistan with well over 200 million people, and to the right or east of India, you have another 170 million people, and all of them, all three of those countries combined have 1.8 billion people and more than 800 million people under the age of 30. So they're young, they are tech savvy, they speak English, and it's still pretty early. The smartphone penetration in that part of the world is way behind the U.S., the developed world, and China. But that's changing quickly.
And your website also describes India's growth as at an inflection point itself, I think, with the unique entrepreneurial conditions that gave rise to Silicon Valley, for example, now being described as actually present in India. So what are those conditions, and what has that meant for startup growth in that region?
Well, the good news is for India, I mean, they had a technology sector for a long time before the internet came along.
Yeah.
A lot of countries didn't really have a tech sector as fully developed as India has had, mostly in IT outsourcing. But what you need to have this story continue, and it's continuing, and it's happening everywhere on the planet. You need entrepreneurs. You need experienced, smart, risk-taking entrepreneurs, founders. You need a venture capital culture and a venture capital market, and India has that well developed. And you add those two things together, and not every startup works, but every one that does work is creating sometimes dozens and dozens of new startups. As the successful companies create wealth for the early employees, the founders get rich, the employees get rich, they become angel investors, they start their own company, and that can't be put back in the bottle. And India has a very well-educated population. Their IITs, their technology colleges are world class, and they've got the engineers, and they've got, I think, critical mass in terms of the first step, which is getting the money on the phone and the mobile payments part of the story. So it's hard to see how this can be anything but a big growth story over the next 15 years or 20 years even.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then that's private markets, I suppose, and the startup kind of growth in the region, which seems pretty established. But how about public markets? Are these innovative companies starting to IPO, or are the majority still private?
Well, I'd say the majority in terms of the number of them, and even some of the largest ones, are still private. But
yeah,
if we look back at our universe of all the emerging market internet companies, which currently there's 125 that are public that we invest in.
Yeah.
3 years ago, we only had 2 Indian companies, and there was beginning in 2021 there was 20 IPOs, so there are now 22 public Indian internet companies, and there's the number of unicorns there is very long, and some of them are very big, like Flipkart, like the Reliance Geo platforms. So I would, and others have noted this. I think Goldman Sachs predicts that there'll be hundreds of public Indian internet companies when the IPO markets resume.
Yeah, got it. Okay, and we'll get onto a couple of those companies in a moment. But the story is bigger, as I think you alluded to a moment ago. It's bigger than just India. South Asia is ripe for these sorts of companies in this environment. You visited companies recently, I think, and founders across South Asia last month, taking in Dhaka, Lahore, as well as Bangalore, Mumbai, and Delhi, of course. But which companies did you meet in Bangladesh? I was particularly interested in that region. It's not a region I know a lot about, and perhaps our listeners won't either.
Sure. Well, and frankly, I know a lot more about it now, having visited Bangladesh last month. So I wanted to, there's, first of all, let me just be clear. There are no public internet companies in either Bangladesh or Pakistan.
Yeah.
Yet. There are plenty of entrepreneurs. There are ecosystems. And I visited with two of the largest private companies. In Dhaka, we visited with ShopUp. And ShopUp is a well-funded by US venture investors largely startup. And what makes Bangladesh super fascinating is the density. I mean, you have 170 million people, and the entire country is the size of Iowa. And it is the densest country on the planet, and you can feel it. I mean, it is bumper to bumper in pretty much every way you can imagine. Of you go on the streets and there's carts and rickshaws and tuk-tuks and cement trucks and people on foot, and it's just a mashup of movement and humans. And they're young, and the economy is ripe for digitization. And what ShopUp is doing is mainly providing an app to the mom and pop stores that dominate the region. So in South Asia, one of the things that listeners probably don't know this, but we had in the US and the developed world a retail industry that's developed for hundreds of years now, and we've had the big box stores and the mom and pops in the US have largely been replaced by the Targets and the Walmarts and so forth, Costco's. But in South Asia, over 90% of all their retail spending happens at these small Kirana stores. They have a different name in Bangladesh, but they're basically a small, sometimes just a window on the street, and they might have 150 or 200 items. So just the basics of milk, sugar, soda, whatever it might be. And there's 10 million of those stores, and they're, providing over 90% of the consumer purchases. And so what is happening in all of South Asia is they're digitizing those shop owners, and they're giving them an app that allows them to, first of all, take digital payments and to make sure their inventory is being restocked on a regular basis. They're cutting out layers of middlemen. And so instead of closing the shop and having to go across town to the wholesale market to get your product, it's going to be delivered right to your store. And one of the things that you see, and this is happening all over emerging markets in different ways, but it all starts with that digital payments, right? Both for the consumer and the merchant. And once you get that and you become that payments facilitator, you can really become the bank, and you can provide lending, investment products, savings products to the shop owners. And so in addition to their e-commerce app, they have a separate part of it that's a financial services play. And then what they've also done, which I found very impressive, is they've built out their own distribution system. So they have a third platform that basically is the most complete logistics network in the country now. So the iron triangle model that you see in companies like Alibaba.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I was going to ask you about ShopUp. I saw that you visited with them. I think I was reading a TechCrunch article yesterday. I think they've raised over $231 million from predominantly US investors, as far as I could tell, and some pretty notable names in that investor list as well. So yeah, pretty exciting company by all accounts. But from that trip, then, were there any other companies or founders that you visited with? Anyone that was that particularly stood out to you?
When we met with journalists that cover the technology space, and we met with investors that are part of the ecosystem, actually a government-sponsored fund that is trying to accelerate this technology effort. And the only other thing I would say of note that we saw in Bangladesh, and we didn't visit with any of the management, but there's a company called Bcash, which is basically the payments platform. and it now has about 70 million people. So almost half of the country now is paying for everything on a day-to-day basis using
Wow.
the Bcash app. And again, it's once you get that money on the phone, it's a big accelerant. And you know, one of the things that when you think about our experience with technology and e-commerce, we've had credit cards and debit cards. You know, I've had one since I was 20 years old, or even 18 years old. So I've had a form of digital payment for 30 something years. And every place I want to walk into, there's a card reader on the counter. And now I don't even have to put the card in. You just tap it. Well, the world doesn't have credit cards and ATM cards the way we have. And so they're skipping that whole thing. And they're even more digital than we are. And that's sort of the paradox, right? I'm a fintech entrepreneur in San Francisco. If we went back in time, you'd think I would be the person that's the most like George Jetson and, you know, zapping my phone to pay for things. It's not me. I use my phone probably 3 or 4 times as much to make payments in South Asia as I do in my day-to-day life here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we move back to India then and kind of cover them more, the fund more specifically, any interesting companies or particularly interesting companies you visited with in Pakistan?
Well, I met with a lot of founders there, and Pakistan has all of the same favorable demographics. It's got its own unique challenges. It had a horrible flooding event in the last year. There's been political instability there, but they have this enormous young population, and a lot of these young entrepreneurs that I met with had, you know, only returned in the last couple of years. They'd been living in Toronto or in New York and working in the tech industry here, and they've returned home because they've seen opportunity. They've seen glimmers that maybe the great opportunity of Pakistan will begin to be released by a government that gets a little bit more progressive in things. But they have issues, and they have some, you know, as a country, they have some financial problems, but they're very young, and they have, I think, a lot going for them. In terms of companies, the main company that hosted us is a company called Dastagir, which is essentially a very similar model to what I described as ShopUp. So again, those mom and pop stores dominate, you know, all of the retail market, and they might have, you know, each of these, and there might be, you know, every, you know, 30, 40 yards on a street, you'll find one of these shops, and they may have, you know, 100 families that are their client base that they have served for potentially years. And so rather than, again, displace that sort of distribution model, what they're doing is digitizing and making it easier for these people to take payments, to manage inventory, to not have to close down the window to go, you know, restock. And I think it's fascinating. There were similar things like this happening because, you know, these undeveloped retail infrastructures that exist in the developing world. They exist in lots of places. You know, there's the markets, the old central market that where you'd go, and the wholesale market and the retail markets. Those, you know, they're getting replaced by the digital version. And again, the sources, the producers are the same, the end customers are the same. It's the middlemen and the distribution and the logistics of getting, whether it's a potato or you know, a smartphone, whatever it is, it's the logistics and distribution costs that are being squeezed out, and where the profits are going to come from.
Yeah, got it. Okay, well, that's an important trend across South Asia then, and one that our investors and listeners should look out for. But let's return to INQQ and India more specifically. The India Internet and E-Commerce ETF is designed to provide exposure to the internet and e-commerce sectors in India, of course. So firstly, how many stocks does the fund hold? Talk to us about the size of that public universe at the moment.
Well, right now there's 22 holdings in INQQ. And again, there was there weren't enough companies to launch the fund until a year ago. So,
Right. Okay.
once we had 20 companies, which is, essentially to create an index that an ETF can track, you need to have the diversification to meet the diversification rules. And so essentially you need 20 companies to create that type of an index. And so we knew the India story was coming. We knew the IPOs were happening. We could see that the growth rate in India is going to be and is the fastest for e-commerce and for their just economic growth in general on the planet today. And so we were ready once we got past that 20 companies mark. And so today there's 22. But as mentioned, there's likely that number will very likely double in the next 2 years, as long as the IPO markets come back. And one thing that's also unique about the Indian internet companies, people probably know this, that the Chinese internet companies, the Alibabas, the Baidus, these companies are listed in the United States on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. And the reason is in all over the world, these internet companies are getting funded largely by US institutional investors, which is a good thing for investors because you have the corporate governance that's, I think you can expect to be higher than you'd find in the broader emerging markets indexes, because Harvard and Stanford's endowments are investing in them. But so that's why most of these internet companies, most of the EMQQ companies trade on the NYSE or the NASDAQ. The Indian companies, for a number of reasons, including bureaucracy, they're choosing to list at home on their own exchanges. And because India right now is, somewhat insulated from the geopolitical problems in the world, and in some ways might be benefiting from them, I think it's quite possible that their IPO market domestically could restart, even if the global IPO markets are still a little slow. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some more Indian internet IPOs this year. There hasn't been one in a while, about a year now, but I have a sense that some of the bigger ones will be coming soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to dig into that point you made there, to what extent are India insulated from these geopolitical sort of headwinds that exist elsewhere in the world? A lot of listeners won't be close to the Indian sort of narrative and growth story. So talk to us about why they're insulated from those macro headwinds.
Well, the tensions in the world right now. I mean, I guess if we're going to point to where these geopolitical issues are, where you have the United States versus China, and whatever you want to call that relationship, a Cold War, a trade war, chest pounding, we're bigger than you, war, whatever that's called. So China's in that. And then Russia, of course, and the Russia situation, which also brings into, further, excuse me, let me restart that. The Russia thing, which also brings China in, is China on Russia's side? Are they not on their side? Xi Jinping's trying to, broker some kind of a peace deal himself. So it's those things that India is pretty much not involved with. And a lot of it is because they're, I think, frankly, they aren't as big as China. And, if India had grown the way China was and had started to threaten the US in terms of its economic strength, then maybe we'd be having challenges with India. But India, because it's remained poor, certainly relative to China's great wealth that they've created in the last couple decades, it just isn't really seen as an adversary for many reasons. And it's a democracy, which, at least on paper, a lot of people are questioning whether or not Modi isn't more autocratic than democratic, but it is a democracy. And so India is pretty much not involved in the, I mean, they're involved as little as they can be. And actually, in some ways, they're benefiting from access to cheap oil, which is giving them another advantage during this, time of trouble.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. And as you say, that's seeing a lot of them list domestically. And you're essentially ensuring that you're providing a level of pure play exposure to India, I suppose, by making sure that all constituents must derive at least 50% of their revenue from the region. How do you go about sort of validating that? Is that a case of you looking through, balance sheets to ensure that that is the case to avoid these more international companies, or is it a little bit easier than that?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest problems in emerging markets investing is the database itself. And I discovered this very early on in my emerging market days. And, I saw there was an emerging market consumer ETF that invested in, before I made EMQQ, which is, the smartphone version of consumption. Before I realized that the smartphone was going to, take over the rest of the world the way it took over our world, I told people to buy the emerging market consumer ETF. But when I went through the list of all the companies in the emerging market consumer ETF, the two biggest holdings, the database said they were emerging markets, and because their headquarters were in South Africa, and South Africa is an emerging market. And so I thought, okay, well, this is good. And one was a newspaper company, and the other one was a furniture company. And so I thought, okay, well, those are both consumer products. And then when I dug in a little further, I saw that all the furniture got sold to people in France and Germany. So it looked like an emerging market consumer stock in the database, but the cash registers, the actual business was in Europe. And the South African newspaper company, it's 100% of its value was derived from a Chinese internet company they had invested in. So I thought, well, wait a minute. The database says these are emerging market consumer companies. They're in the fund and the problem is that, I'm a Warren Buffett person first and foremost, but I've been working in the, around and with the indexing world for a couple of decades now as well. And what I find is that there seems to be this gap because, the traditional active people, the analysts, they're digging into these companies and they charge fees to do that, and and maybe they're good and they'll beat the market here and there. But the indexers, that's a low cost thing. They don't have the army of MBAs to pour through this stuff. And you'd be shocked how many of these things get missed or get put in the wrong place. Almost at least half of our companies aren't even in the index. I mean, in Latin America, we have 16 holdings and only one of them is in the MSCI index. And it's not my job to figure out why exactly, but I think it has to do with the database and where these companies get put. And because, as I mentioned, a lot of them, the Southeast Asian companies, they're all incorporated in Singapore. Well, the database says that's a developed country. And the mailbox is in Singapore and they have an office in Singapore, but their businesses are in Vietnam, Cambodia, and so forth. So what we look to is not what the database says. I mean, the database is generally right, but it's not precisely right. And if you just go with the database, you're going to miss things or include stuff that shouldn't be included. So what we care about is that your business, the customers and where they're buying and doing their business is in these emerging and frontier markets. So we check, as you said, the rule is you have to have at least 50%. The reality is that in almost every one of these, it's 100% for the Indian companies. Now, it gets trickier in places like South America, where the biggest e-commerce company is headquartered in Uruguay, that generates most of its revenue in Brazil and Mexico. So it's not as challenging to do this correction in India as it is elsewhere.
Yeah, got it. Okay, yeah, and that's something that we spoke about when we covered EMQQ, which was the first of now 3 interviews that we've done with you. So I'll post a link to that and the subsequent interview, which was about your second fund, FMQQ, which is EMQQ minus China, or at least that's the way I remember it. We'll post all the links to that content in the episode description. But in terms of the formation of the fund, before we move on to a couple of Indian companies that I noticed you hold, the fund is market cap weighted as far as I could tell, but then the largest positions are capped at 8%, I think. And what was the rationale for that?
That's right. We have the same methodology across all 3 of our approaches. And it's market cap weighted, but there's a limit of 8% for the largest holding, and the reason for that is to ensure that you achieve diversification in some of these markets. At least when they get started, you'll find one company will be giant, Alibaba and Tencent when we launched originally, and if we put them in at a pure market cap weight, they might be half of the fund, and then you would be in violation of the registered investment company diversification rules. So that's why we have the 8% cap.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, one more question before we move on to constituents then. Kind of with the conversation we've had so far in mind, what time horizon should an investor looking at INQQ have in mind? You know, this is obviously a longer term growth story, but what does long term mean?
Well, look, the stock market is a place for long-term investing. I mean, the majority of people that are participating aren't investing, but if you want to do it the right way, what you want to do is buy and hold great businesses and let the miracle of compounding work for you. And so, you know, at least a 5-year time frame, but it's the 10 and 20-year time frame that is where people can really, I think, achieve a very meaningful return. And because, you know, it is by far the most important thing in investing is that compounding element. And so I think that the growth is going to be there for a decade, maybe 2 decades of, I think, very solid growth. And the best way to do it is to buy it and hold it, and buy more and just keep buying and hold it. And so in particular, younger investors, people in their 20s, 30s, even 40s, you know, if you're 40 years old, you've still got 20 plus years until, you know, traditional retirement. And so even though you might think of yourself as not being young, you still have a lot of time. So I think, I don't know of any sector on the planet that is going to grow as fast as this over the next, you know, as mentioned, decade plus.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, to make this slightly less abstract then, let's talk about a couple of companies in INQQ. So currently, I think your largest holding when I checked yesterday was Reliance Industries, maybe a company some people are familiar with listening in. So that had a 7.71% weighting when I checked yesterday. It might be slightly different now, but they're a conglomerate with varied interests, I suppose. But what specifically interests you most about Reliance, and how are they facilitating growth in the Indian internet and e-commerce sectors specifically?
Sure. So let me first make another note. You asked about the 50%, you know,
Yes.
threshold for inclusion. This was another area where we had to apply that same analysis, because, as you mentioned, they have other legacy economy businesses, but once we deemed that more than half of the value of the company was related to its digital and online assets, that's when we decided that we would add it. So Reliance is a third generation family controlled conglomerate. The original businesses were in petrochemicals and textiles, but they really ended up with holdings in everything, in hotels, in retail. They've got the largest combined number of retail locations, and what they did, I want to say 7 years ago now, maybe 6, they made an incredibly bold move, and they got into the mobile phone service business. They're a carrier, and they launched the country's first 4G network, Reliance Jio. And what they did was, this is right when the smartphones were arriving in India, if you will, and there was a pretty fragmented market of phone carriers, and they launched Reliance Jio, and they basically gave people 3 months a free trial of unlimited voice and data, and then they promised to have the lowest cost after that, and they ended up amassing about 500 million subscribers. Wow. Onto their network, and now they're working on a nationwide 5G network, which they've targeted completion of by the end of this year. So their goal is to have the whole country on 5G. And so once they did that, they then because they have over 20,000 physical locations, and again, as I mentioned, this story, this e-commerce story, the way it's playing out in emerging markets and India in particular, is rather than build the warehouses and do the sort of Amazon model, they utilize the existing distribution points. So the actual physical locations have value in places like India. I'm so sorry, my guy's blowing the weed eater right outside of my door. Can you hear that?
No worries, still. I can't actually hear it.
You can't hear it?
No.
Okay, I shouldn't have stopped. I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right.
I thought for sure you could hear it, but maybe it's my sound deadening wall panel. So
Yeah.
Why don't you want me to restart, or
Yeah, maybe kind of pick up from where you left off. Don't worry about starting right from the beginning of that answer, because we can cut out the middle section.
Okay, fine. So as mentioned, Reliance also has over 20,000 actual physical stores, and those become very valuable in terms of forming the distribution network for e-commerce. And so they have that going for them. And then what they did right at the beginning of the pandemic, they raised a massive round of financing, $30 billion.
Wow.
For Geo, and that money came from most of it came from Google and Facebook.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I think that those two companies in particular were interested in investing in Geo is that the Indian government has made it very clear that they want the homegrown companies to be the tech giants. They don't want the Silicon Valley, the US internet companies to own their e-commerce market.
Yeah.
And so they put in place various market share limits for certain segments. And so I think what the US tech companies have realized is if they're going to win in India, it's going to be in partnership with one of their homegrown companies, which is another reason that Walmart got involved by purchasing Flipkart several years ago.
Yeah, okay. Well, on that point then, I recently read about GeoMart, a company owned by Geo Platforms in which Reliance Industries have a majority stake. So GeoMart was described as, in the article I read, it said that it was making a dent in Amazon and Walmart's e-commerce stronghold in India. So to that point then, to what extent are they capable of securing a major foothold in the Indian e-commerce space and even edge out these international competitors? Or do you think it will be more of a collaboration or hybrid model?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, this is shaping up as the biggest battle on the planet in this sector, and Geo shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, Amazon's been neck and neck with Flipkart, which again Walmart controls now, and but Geo has a lot of things going for it, and it's still so early that I think their ability to grab the future market share it hasn't been proven yet, but they have been so successful in all the other parts of the story that I wouldn't be surprised to see them take a pretty meaningful share of the story going forward.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, before we finish on kind of looking ahead and asking for your outlook for this space, are there any other constituents that we haven't spoken about that you think are worthy of kind of highlighting, that particularly excite you, or perhaps our listeners are less likely to be familiar with?
Well, I think Paytm, which is the mobile payments platform, I think that company is a great way to get exposure to the story. I mean, and they've got we met with them in Bombay, and I think that they the mobile payments part of this is the growth rate is incredible right now in India, and again Paytm is participating in that. And and we've seen this all over the world, that once you get the money on the phone, that payments, which may not be a very good margin or high margin part of the business, but once you get the money on the phone, then you become a financial service provider, and you can again do lending and banking. You can end up holding investment portfolios. Other people buy stocks and ETFs and so forth on the platforms. You can sell insurance. We've seen this in China. We've seen this in Latin America, and I think we'll see it in South Asia as well. I mean, people don't have, there's not brick and mortar banks and ATM machines, and nobody's got a debit card. So it's that getting the money on the phone allows you to have pole position for becoming the financial services provider for the millions of users that you have just for your payments platform.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So,
completely crucial to facilitating that more digitally native community, I suppose.
Yeah, so Paytm, I would say, would be one. Another company we met with, which is super interesting, is Nykaa, Nykaa, and that's an online beauty store. And they have some physical locations as well now, but it's a online beauty products. And the statistics on this opportunity are very big. I mean, the amount of money that is spent on beauty products in India is very low relative to the developed market, and we've seen that play out in China. That's been a booming high growth segment for years and years and years, and I think the same will be the case in India. And Nykaa has the largest market share there, and it's also a fascinating company. It's most of the founders that you see in these companies, they start the companies when they're in their 20s or maybe 30s. But this company was founded by a woman who was an investment banker, and she had promised she would become an entrepreneur before she turned 50, and she got pretty close and said, all right, now or never. And now she's the second self-made woman billionaire in India. So it's a great story as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, not a company I'd heard of, actually. So really interesting. And finally, then I mentioned it would be good to finish with looking ahead. I suppose we ask most people we speak to what their next big idea is, what the next big idea or technological innovation coming out of the particular space that they're an expert in might be. I wonder whether there's something that you can point to looking at India or South Asia more generally. I've not heard much regarding generative AI's impact in India, for example. I don't know whether you've got anything to say to that, but not a specific company, but more just a technological innovation that you think is going to have a massive impact in that region.
Well, as regards to AI, I think, I don't have a strong enough opinion yet about, I mean, there's a lot of hype, a lot of noise around it. My few experiments with it didn't, well, I'm not sure how AI will be part of the story. I'm sure it will be in some way, shape, or form, but we'll see what that means. And I would say, look, this is really simple. I mean, I would say it's just India. India is like China was 17 years ago or 15 years ago. And the infrastructure is going in, the people are young, they're hungry, and their economy's, likely to be the fastest growing major economy. And they're getting computers for the first time, and it's happening, 7 or 8 million people a month are getting their first ever computer, and they've never had a library, they've never had a phone. Well, they've probably had a mobile phone before, but they haven't had all the things that we have. And all of a sudden, overnight, they're getting this device that gives them everything. And so what I like about this story in the India version, the INQQ, the Indian Internet stories, it's right in front of us. I mean, we know the numbers. I've never known anyone that used to have a smartphone, and you've got hundreds of millions of people that are going to get one, today or tomorrow, and hundreds of millions that just got them. And so the growth is right in front of us. And sure, things could go wrong, the world has lots of risks, but when you look at the story of India and the internet and e-commerce, it seems to me quite obvious that it doesn't need AI or the metaverse or anything else for it to happen. And so I think to me, that's the one thing that I'm most excited about right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And a nice point to end on, I think. That leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.